Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, wherever you might be watching, listening. Welcome to another episode of Israel and Christians Today podcasts. My name is Andrew Tucker, and I'm in conversation with Johannes Gerloff. I'm in the Netherlands. Johannes is in the outskirts of Jerusalem, and we're talking...
Shalom.
Yeah. Shalom, Johannes. We're talking about international law, and we're going to pick up on the conversation we actually started last podcast about the allegation that Israeli settlers are war criminals. And we're digging into why people think that and what is behind this. And is it about law or is it about morals? What is driving this discussion? And I just want to emphasize how significant this is. This is not just an intellectual exercise. It's not just about language. This is about the lives of ordinary people. Now, right at this moment, I am very close to The Hague, and a lot of the work I do is in The Hague and in international law. The International Criminal Court is located in The Hague. There are two main international courts in The Hague. One is the International Court of Justice. That's the oldest court in the Peace Palace. The other is the International Criminal Court, which was established 2 decades ago. And the task of the International Criminal Court is to prosecute war criminals. This is an international regime set up under a Treaty of Rome, to prosecute the worst war criminals in the world. And the whole idea is because some of these war criminals are not being caught and are not being brought to justice by their own countries, we need an international system which does that. The prosecutor has announced that she intends to prosecute Israeli leaders for the settlement policies of the State of Israel. What does it mean? It means they're going to prosecute people like Benjamin Netanyahu or others. Names have not been mentioned yet, but those who were responsible over the last few decades for allowing Israelis, meaning Jews, because all the Israelis who live there are Jews, or at least the vast majority of them. Johannes, you're a very good exception. Israelis living in these so-called occupied territories are doing so as a result of an illegal policy of the State of Israel. Now, that means that they are being called war criminals. In the media, you see a statement like, the settlements are illegal. Not just Israeli government, but the settlements are illegal. And what is a settlement? Well, settlement is no more or less than a person. You, Johannes, are a settlement. You're a person. The word settlement has no legal description in international law. It's just a political term we use. Legally speaking, the criminal act is allowing a person like yourself to live where you are living, or just to be there. That's what is illegal. But I just want to finish this to say that people say the settlements are illegal. And one of the reasons they say it is because of a judgment of the International Court of Justice, 2004, which the court made this statement that the Israeli settlements are illegal. And this is picked up by the media, it's picked up by the political world to say the settlements themselves are illegal, which becomes a claim that the individuals are somehow war crimes, but they're not. It's the Israeli leaders who are being charged potentially with war crimes.
Sorry if I'm interrupting you here. First of all, thank you very much for explaining this complicated way. And we are trying to understand what is going on here. And I try to kind of bring against your describing the European mindset, I try to bring in Israeli-Palestinian reality And I first of all would like to say, and it's a pain in the neck for Israelis and Palestinians, that there is nothing like an Israeli settlement policy. Now, as a journalist, and I would like to protect the media a little bit, we have to report what we hear being said by Israelis. We don't have to bring in our own opinion, and we report what you in Holland or Germany or wherever you sit pay for. So that is the tricky thing. Now here today, I'm in a little bit better position, and I can ask you, Andrew, to understand better what is going on. And I want to in a way, explode into your face my desperation, because there is no settlement policy. There is a settlement zigzag. There is, and it's an amazing fact. If you go back, the person who gave the Palestinians the most territory is called Benjamin Netanyahu. Just measure the square kilometers, go back in history, and ask which prime minister, under which prime minister's rule, the Palestinians were given the most territory. Forget all the legal background. And now go back again and say, when did the settlers, under which governments did the settlers flourish and build the most? And you will realize that the worst settlement leader was called Shimon Peres, the one who built the most settlements. And the only prime minister that ever made a settlement, stopped building in the settlements officially, was Benjamin Netanyahu. The only prime minister ever coming up, and in a way admitting that it's wrong to build in settlements, but coming up and say, we stopped for 8 months. That's what he did. Now look, that is one point. It simply doesn't fit reality. And the other thing is, I do not know a single Israeli that has been deported or transferred, using these words, deporting or transferred to where he lives today. Now, as a journalist, I have to admit, and this might mix you up, but I give you the word at once to explain this to me. I covered, for example, the deportation of settlers from Ammona, which the whole world applauded because it was an illegal settlement, even according to Israeli law. And I remember settlers in front of cameras saying, I'm disappointed, I'm quoting now, I'm disappointed by the Israeli government because first they brought us here, says the European, they deported us, and now they're taking us away. We are a kind of game for them. Now, I would like to stand up to every Israeli claiming stuff like that and saying to his face, you were not deported. And I witnessed what was going on here for the past 30 years. You were not deported. You moved there by your own decision as a civilian, sometimes even against the Israeli government's policy. Yeah. There is a settler movement. And because Israel is a democracy, the Israeli government has to look for voters. And I said, today it's about 10% of the Israeli population that are settlers, according to European understanding. So I feel that you are, in describing this situation of European thinking, you are far away from deportation, from the situation here. And let me make one thing very clear. I am like you, hopefully, like the European, hopefully. I'm very much European, and I'm against acquiring ground or territory by force like Hitler or Stalin did. I'm very much in line there with the basis of international law, and I agree with it. And secondly, I agree it is absolutely immoral and should be absolutely in line with international law that no government has the right to deport civilian population in whatever direction. I'm fully agreeing with that. Whether these governments are called Hitler or Stalin or Benjamin Netanyahu, I don't care. Sorry to Benjamin Netanyahu for naming him in this context. No, deportation should be illegal. But in the same straight, we have to say the only way I saw people deported here in Israel was when Gaza was sorry for the words, cleansed of Jews. There was a deportation for political reasons. And from my point of view, this should be illegal. But otherwise, I did not see deportation of Israelis into occupied territories. Never saw it.
Okay, but you say there was no settlement policy, but there was, after the Six-Day War, there were all kinds of policies developed about what to do with these territories. You had the Alon Plan, for example. And there was clearly a policy of some sort developed to allow Israelis to live in these territories. There has to be, otherwise it can't happen. So if you think of, take Maale Adumim, for example, on the outskirts of Jerusalem is considered a settlement. Well, there is a positive Israeli plan, a policy to build that community, build that city. And
let me explain to you or to our listeners that Maale Adumim is that example that is very often taken, but it is a unique example. Because after 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli government discovered that they are absolutely vulnerable towards the east. There's nothing preventing an army coming up from Jordan against Jerusalem. And therefore, yes, Maale Adumim was decided to be planted for strategic reasons.
Yeah.
But Maale Adumim was not the first settlement. It was settlements like Hebron, which actually was a Jewish city for more than 3,000 years. And I can say today that in Hebron always lived Jews uninterruptedly. And I know that with personal connections. There was one Jewish woman who was married to a Palestinian who lived even in Jordanian times, all the time there, and afterwards helped settlers to identify Jewish houses of before 1967. That means of houses from before 1948, from before 1929, the massacre there. There was an uninterrupted Jewish presence in Hebron. And yes, it was against Israeli policy that Rabbi Levinger went back and settled there and did not leave again, as Israeli government wanted it. So we can choose our examples. And yes, Maale Adumim was a strategic kind of decision. But therefore, I would ask, I mean, if we talk about law, we talk about something objective. We talk about something that is kind of above us, and we have to submit to it. And you feel that I'm getting a little bit emotional because I see people here on the ground. And also as a theologian, if people only serve the law, I'm getting emotional because it will kill them, as the New Testament tells us.
Okay, Johannes, let me...
From my point of view, the law has to serve the people.
I agree. I think it might help us. There are two things that I think happened after 1967, actually after the Yom Kippur War. I think the 6 years between the Six-Day War in 67 and the Yom Kippur War in 73, it was still very unclear to people how to deal with all of this. And the Yom Kippur War, I think, forced a change. Now, one important thing happened was that there's a very, very strong line of opinion within Israeli legal circles that these are occupied territories and Israel has no business in the territories. And one of the reasons they take that view, and one of the lead proponents of that view is Professor Yoram Dinstein at Tel Aviv University, who has written the international legal, most leading, probably one of the first and still regarded as one of the leading authorities on the law of belligerent occupation. He took the view that these are occupied territories. They're not part of the state of Israel. and therefore potentially any settlement policies, what the activities of not only enabling Jews and Israelis to live there, but to actually make it possible and to advance it is illegal. Now, one of the reasons he says that's the case is to protect Zionism. The view is, if Israel were to take sovereignty over these territories, it has to take sovereignty over the Palestinians. If you take sovereignty over the Palestinians, you lose your ethnic majority and Zionism is dead. Now, I've had this conversation with Dinstein and others like him, and he gets as emotional as you do, if much more emotional, because he says, to take the opposite view, because you have those who argue that Israel does have sovereignty, he says, well, that is the end of Zionism. And he would regard himself as being a staunch defender of the Zionist vision by creating this distinction between Israel and the occupied territories, because in this way, we don't take responsibility for the Palestinians. There has to be some other solution, whether it's a two-state solution or something else. And you create this division. And this, I'm afraid to say, is a strong Israeli position. And it was the dominant Israeli position within international legal circles and also outside Israel.
Maybe just for the understanding of our listeners, I would like to re-emphasize that they understand, first of all, we are not talking here pro-Israeli, pro-Arab. We are trying to analyze a situation legally. And as you have heard now from Andrew, there is strong, to what I try to show, there is strong opposition within Israeli society against what I try to show in favor of the settler side. So that is one point. I also want to admit that Dinstein is right, but I come from a biblical point of view, not necessarily from a Zionist point of view. And I'm not saying that the Bible is against Zionism and the Bible is non-Zionist, but we have to talk there a little bit more differentiated within. If Dinstein understands Zionism as something like Jewish, then I have to emphasize the Bible always saw Jews and non-Jews together, also living together. And if I was for Bibi Netanyahu annexing the territories, which was a few months ago in discussion, and went off the table because of the peace treaty with the United Arab Emirates, I was for it because I wanted Israel to take responsibility for those who are up until now second-class citizens. I'm talking about the Palestinians. And I think if there are human beings, we have to encounter each other on the same level and not being treated one preferred and the other, and privileged and the other second class. And I can go on talking about the environment, talking about legal questions where settlements indeed are outside Israeli law. If Bibi would have annexed it, we would have had one law for everybody. We could environmentally not blame as Israelis, as the Palestinians, of spilling their wastewater into the territory and doing it ourselves, and the Israelis and the Palestinians say, oh, it was the Israelis. This blame situation would have been gone. We would know who is responsible. And this is, I'm talking here on the ground. These are ones of the questions why I am asking these questions about international law and why international law is behaving here, or European diplomats or legal experts are behaving here like they could talk here into private lives as if they would be morally better. So okay, well, that is something, and there's no discussion in Europe about all these things.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so all I'm trying to do is, I think, explain, I'm not defending or I'm not saying I'm for or against, I'm just trying to explain the thinking and how it developed. Because academics are part of the system. they're more than part of the system. They are extremely influential in framing the legal thinking, which then determines how governments act. So they listen to the academics because academics help to develop international law. They're a recognized source of international law. So what they say matters. But I think it's important to understand the reasoning behind this very strong view within Israel and within the Jewish world generally. It's not just the Jewish world. There are others who support it, but there is a strong movement within the Jewish world which is very pro-separation and pro-two-state. Now, the second thing that happened, I think, is significant, is what happened in Europe in the 1970s. And that is Europe was unifying, and France was the leader of Europe at the time and pushing for European integration. The creation of a unified Europe was very anti-American, and it was very pro-Arab. And essentially what you had was the development of a political partnership between France and the political elite of Europe and the Arab world. It became known as the Euro-Arab dialogue. It developed after 1973. And part of that dialogue and part of the agreement really between Europe and what was known as the Mediterranean world was the idea that the Palestinians' rights had to become the center of attention. They weren't before that. As you rightly said, nobody talked of the Palestinians when Jordan occupied the territories. All of a sudden, the Palestinians come into the picture, and Europe agrees to allow the Palestinians to achieve some kind of nationhood. It wasn't called statehood yet, but an acknowledgement and acceptance that the Palestinian problem has to be solved. And I think that political choice that was made explains why the Europeans are so strong about international law. And they're much stronger about the law of occupation when it comes to Israel and Palestine than they are in relation to any other conflict. They don't prosecute Russian leaders for the war crime of settlements in Crimea, or Turkey for the war crime of settlements in northern Cyprus, but they are wanting to prosecute Israelis. And I think it's got to do with this mentality about having a solution to the problem, a political solution to the problem. And in my view, international law is a convenient language and tool to explain that political perspective, which leads us into the question of, what is international law then? But international law is no more or no less really than a language, a toolkit to express political positions. At the end of the day, law is about politics. Law is politics. And it can be, you can explain it in one way or another, and you're both right in a way. It's very difficult, but I think that helps a little bit to understand the dynamic of this legal discussion about occupation.
Andrew, I think this is very interesting, and I have the feeling we have to do a third one because I did not get my questions down, and you brought up further questions from my point of view. You said right now that, and I don't want to go deeper in it, just to raise awareness also among our listeners, that you said international law is about a solution. Now, I know that Europeans especially always talk about the solution of the Middle East conflict. And if you talk about the Middle East conflict, you talk about the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors. You do not talk about the millions, and it's really millions of dead people during the past decades in inner Arab strife. I mean, just imagine that in Syria in the last decade, per year, more people were killed than in the whole of the Middle East conflict on both sides. Per year, Syrian civil war, more people killed. The Iraqi-Irani war in the 1980s killed 10 times as many people as if you look today back on the Middle East conflict. So in a way, it's perverse. I'm sorry if I say that as somebody who experienced war here, who lives in the middle of this whole situation. It's perverse to focus so much on one tiny luxury conflict in seeing what a bloodbath we're living in. But now you're coming and talk about the solution of the Middle East conflict. What solution do you have for Europe? Let's just take the borders. The borders of Europe all the time change. They changed a few months ago with the Brexit. Israel's borders that were never really clearly defined by international law. Israel's borders are much more stable than the borders of Europe. You are trying for the past 70 years, and don't come now and say in a more peaceful way, just look at the Balkans, or just look at inner strife like I don't want to mention the Baskans or the Catalonians. We have a lot of strife in Europe. We are trying, we are experimenting. I think we should continue this once more and ask also the questions, why is it that Europeans are not coming more in an understanding way and say, yes, we know that politics is about trying something, about understanding each other, about trying new ways. Look, be relaxed. We try in Europe for the past 70 years in a sometimes more peaceful, sometimes less peaceful way to find a way to live together. And I have to say, as a German, I very much like that today I cannot take a car and go thousands of kilometers in any direction. I'm very grateful for that. I don't want to diminish that. And therefore, I'm also grateful for new peace agreements or normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states, for example. But I'm talking about now the attitude of Europeans. Why don't we come in a more relaxing way? Instead of talking about a solution, let's try to find a way to live together. And we can change it. We don't have to have a final solution or something like that. But we continue developing things, and we are not in 1945 anymore. And you can't compare the attitude of the Israelis with the attitude of Hitler and Stalin that formed the basis of international law. I'm sorry to say that, but there is a huge difference. And Andrew, I want to give you the final word for this, and you also have the decision because you are, technically speaking, the host as Christians for Israel International. But I think it's very interesting, and thank you very much for giving me this platform to get rid of some questions, and thank you for your patience. And as I said, I have more questions, and maybe this will never end, but maybe one more, I don't know. I don't want to bargain with you. Here in the Middle East, we always bargain, and we are emotional. I'm sorry for that. We are not as relaxed and as down to earth and as sober as you Europeans.
Good, Johannes. No, I think this is a really important conversation. We're definitely not finished yet. So we'll continue it next podcast, and I'm very happy to do it. Because as again, I think there's some very deep issues which this touches on, and I hope we can explore in a little more depth next time. So thank you for this episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all for listening and watching. We'll see you next episode of Israel and Christians Today. Bye-bye.